Now I would like to invite our second presenter, Rabbi Aaron Kotler, President Emeritus at Beth Midrash Goa, New Jersey. And the topic is unrecognized heroism in World War II Lithuania. The Jewish girls, the Japanese ambassador, and the Roman Catholic priest. Escape or survive annihilation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's very special to be here and go downstairs and see a photo of my mother on the walls of the building. And it's been a very special journey for me to discover that almost 80 years after the Holocaust, there are still unrecognized heroes who the world just doesn't know about. We grew up with tales from my mother how she was saved by the Japanese ambassador in Moscow in March of 1941. And when I would speak of that to researchers, they would say, your mother is an old woman and she doesn't have her facts right because Sugihara was no longer issuing visas in March of 1941 and he was in Kaunas, he was not in Moscow, and your mother's an old woman and she just doesn't have her facts right. And, I questioned many details of what she would tell us. And through my fortunate friendship with Linas and Danuta and the others here in Lithuania and Akira Kitati in Japan, we found out much of the story. So to begin with just my family history a little bit, there you see a photo of my grandmother, my mom on the right side, and my two aunts. And they led an idyllic life. These are my grandparents in what was then known as Mamel. The family came to Lithuania in the 1600s. My great-grandfather lived in Mamel, and his parents are buried there. They lived nearby in the village of Varvajan for a while, Varvajanai, and it was a long history. In that history, it was idyllic, would be the only way to describe it. And my mother gave us maps. She would read to me the streets, and I looked up old maps to see where did she live, where was her home, where was the leather business that her dad had, the store that her uncle had in Friedrichsmark, and just a lot of history and a lot of detail. And I began to research that a little bit. Found photos of her school. She went to the German school, which was not uncommon in Mabel in those days. My mother grew up speaking German, and she grew up speaking English, and which we'll come right back to in a moment. And as we know, in March of 1939, my mom was 16. Hitler took over before World War II, this is. And he took over the Klaipeda region, and he spoke in Theater Square, which is just about half a kilometer from my grandparents, my mom's home, and my grandmother actually went to the speech, and when she came home, she said, we have to get out of here. And her own classmates, she had German classmates, they went to the synagogue, which was on her block. They tore the Torah scrolls to shreds, and there were attacks. And unfortunately, in that region, Hitler received a very, very warm welcome. And there was an official order. All the Jews were ordered to leave the Klaipeda region. They were expelled, and it was reported in worldwide newspapers why the Jews were ordered out. The Germans said there's no place for them. And as my mother told us, her dad had a beard. He was an openly visible religious Jew. They wrapped him. He had a leather business. They wrapped him in sheets of leather, and they hid him, and they escaped to Kaunas. And in Kaunas, they rented the upstairs of a home. This building is still there. We went to see it yesterday. I did see they put a new roof on it, new windows, but the building looks exactly the same. Panerai number 9. It formerly was number 15, and they rented the upstairs from a Rabbi Avram Grodzinski, who was burned to death in the Kaunas hospital. And in hiding with my grandparents was Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, who was killed in the 7th fort in Kaunas on July 6, 1941. My aunt was there when he was taken. My grandfather, my mother's dad, was murdered in the what they call the Great Action, as you know so well. Unfortunately, October 29, 1941, at the Ninth Fort, and that day thousands of others were murdered with him, and what was the first mass murders of Jews in Europe in the Holocaust. My grandmother, I'll come back to her in a few moments, but my grandmother survived. We'll come back to how she did it for a while, and she was killed August 30, 1944, or August 31, 1944. There are some discrepancies in the historical pattern. We're still trying to determine. My mother shared with us that she was killed in the forest with partisans near Kedinai. There's a little bit of a problem with the date on that because the Russians had already expelled the Nazis from Kedinai, so it could not have been August 30, 1944. So either the date is wrong or the place is wrong, but we do know that she survived till then. And again, we have firsthand witness testimony and original letters from one of the survivors of that final massacre. And he wrote to my family in 1946 saying whether your mother was killed on the 30th or 31st, he didn't know because some people survived and were shot the next day, but he spoke of a ferocious battle, gun battle between the group of partisans and the others. So that was, my grandparents were murdered in the Holocaust, and the Hebrew letter speaks of Chedan. I always thought it was Kedinai, but again, I'm unsure of the place. So how did my mother and my two aunts survive the Holocaust? They were from the Hidden Children. We had the honor of seeing the exhibit yesterday in Vilnius of the children, and my mom was also saved in a very, very different way. So I will speak of these two unknown rescuers. The rescue of my mom, there you see photos of her young and old, and as my mother related to us, she left Kaunas in 1941, early 1941. She had the benefit of German citizenship. So she was allowed to leave the USSR. If you were Lithuanian, you couldn't, but she had German citizenship. She was able to leave. She traveled to Moscow. Again, Sugihara was no longer issuing visas here. And she stayed in the Metropole Hotel. I did visit it. I took photos of it, got some from online. It's exactly as she had described it. And she went to the Japanese embassy in Moscow. And she shared how when she arrived at the embassy, there was a large group of refugees outside seeking to get visas from the embassy, but the embassy doors were closed. It was late in the evening and they would not let her in. And my mother was very well dressed. She was only 17 years old, alone. She had traveled from Kaunas to Moscow by herself. She had a few friends with her, and she went over to the Soviet guard and she said to the guard in English that she had an appointment with the ambassador. She spoke English, having gone to Augusta Victoria Lyceum in Klaipėda, so we have her marks. She got excellent grades in English. We don't know what the guard thought, but he let her in. She knocked on the door, and she met this gentleman, Yoshitsugu Tatekawa, who was the Japanese ambassador to Moscow at the time. And he was a very interesting historical figure. He was, if you consider Sugihara to be a consular official, he was from the leading elites of the Japanese government. He was a war hero in the Russo-Japanese War. He was also involved in the invasion of Manchuria. You could Google about him. He got into a lot of trouble with that. He defied orders. He was sent by his boss Matsuoka to stop the invasion. He was sent 1,000 kilometers to travel to Manchuria to tell the Japanese army not to invade. Famous Manchurian incident. He did not convey the orders not to invade. He enabled them. Ultimately, he was a rebel in a sense, but he was considered politically unreliable, but politically necessary. He was then posted to Moscow, and I could sort of understand that, because he negotiated one of Japan's greatest triumphs in World War II, which was a treaty between Russia and Japan in which Russia never attacked Japan in World War II. So he was not a mid-level diplomat. He was from the highest levels. I have copies of his cables, his correspondence. He was in direct correspondence with the foreign minister at all times. And here's copies of my mother's passport. Rochelle, you see the J at the top over there on the Rispasa. And Tatekawa, Yoshitsugu Tatekawa gave her a visa on March 8, 1941. A permit to stay in Japan for some total of 10 days. As my mom related it, she said to him after, you know, there were other Jews outside waiting for visas, and he said, I know, but it's late. And she did encourage him, and he opened up the door for some additional people and gave some additional visas that day. I have a copy of a cable that was sent on March 9th, the next day, by his boss, in a series of cables that started in the beginning of 1941, where the Japanese Foreign Ministry was telling Tatekawa, you cannot issue visas to Jews. If the Jews want to get to Japan, they have to go to Vladivostok. We have 100 visas set aside for them in Vladivostok. They should go there. That is where they will be rescued if they're eligible for those visas. But he was defying orders. His definitive order to stop giving visas was on the next day, March 9th, and on March 10th, he continued to issue visas, but he no longer called them visas. He was giving transit certificates. My mother's visa was valid for 10 days. The transit certificates were valid for 14 days. So he certainly knew how to play the political system. When my mom arrived in the port of Tsuruga, her papers were not 100% in order. She did not have the stamp that said that she could go to Curacao, which said no visa required for Curacao. The Japanese authority didn't want to let her in. Kobe Jewish community came and welcomed her, and through that she was able to enter Japan. She was ultimately deported to the Shanghai ghetto, and she was in the Shanghai ghetto, having traveled across Moscow through Siberia to the port of Vladivostok, quite a journey, and over all the way to Osaka, Japan, and then to Shanghai. This is kind of a sense of her life journey, starting in a little village, little town in the Baltic, climbed with the Kaunas to Moscow, to Vladivostok, to Tsuruga, over to Canada. She stayed. She was stuck in Shanghai through the war years. She got tuberculosis in the Shanghai ghetto. The United States would not let her in. She did a little false marriage to someone to get into Canada, and through Canada she smuggled herself into the United States. And when she died at the age of 93, she had a few hundred descendants and many more coming. So incredible work of one human being, and I think provides perspective that Sugihara belongs in an environment where he was certainly the greatest of them, but he was not alone. And ultimately Sugihara was kicked out by Russia, and I've shared the story in Japan, and people really, really appreciated hearing about it. These are just photos of the family and photos of Tatekawa. And these are Sugihara, Consul May, who deserves mention. In Vladivostok, he was saving Jews. And there was an additional gentleman written about in the book, Visas for Life, who was a Japanese, he worked for the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and he helped save Jews too. And this is Tatekawa's final resting place. That's how my mom survived. And how did her sister survive? You see my Aunt Shalamis, my Aunt Rachel, blessed memory, and this is Rachel's papers after the war, seeking information on her family from the Red Cross. It speaks of her parents having been murdered. It says she has a sister, Shalamis Friedman, and she has a sister, Rochelle Cutler, and all. And my Aunt Rachel wrote a letter, a very moving letter, to my mom in Shanghai. My Aunt Rachel wrote it from a sickbed in Switzerland, saying how she was saved and how my Aunt Shalamis was saved. And this is the letter. I'm going to read it real fast. I don't know how to begin the letter. I'm still alive. I don't know anything about our family. Shalamis was at a Lithuanian family. I took her out of the ghetto in December 1943. I don't know her real address. Parish priest Professor Vinkas Venkas, who we later found out was Pranas Venkas, helped us to find a place for her. She got documents and was named Marietta Libagote, and she writes of another family member, a shared child, and others who wanted to leave. And she writes that she hid and she wandered from place to place. This is my Aunt Rachel in her narrative about my Aunt Shalamis. I hid myself in woods, barns, and cellars. I couldn't hide any longer. Many of our brothers who kept all the time, their wives were found and shot. I went to Germany and lived there as Oniata Kelaraiti. She received from Venkas papers, Aryan papers, and she was deported to Germany in German Anna Irene Kellert until now. That was how my Aunt Rachel was saved. And then she writes that my grandmother, who I shared before, had been murdered in the end of 1944. She was with her in the Tel Shai ghetto. She was one of the few who saved herself. And then she writes how they were able to get out, and they hid themselves in a cellar, and then she beseeches, my Aunt Rachel beseeches my mother, do all you can to search for our little sister and mother. She did not know if our grandmother was alive or not. Perhaps our sister forgot that she's a Jew. This is why we saved her. She should live as a Jew. And she writes, you may know they've killed all the best of our nation. When our mother left to get her, she hid 28 days on a mountain of snow. Linus, that's the research I'm doing now, is to see where exactly that was. She gives addresses at Talio's Gatva 24, which we now know is Gymnasio Gatva. So we'll go there hopefully later today. And she writes at other places near Telzai, where my aunt was hidden, and she provides names, Marietta, Piazzolita, and others, and a forester ranger who hid them. And this is the Venkus family, and a highlight of the rescue of my Aunt Shalamis was that Venkus helped them escape from the ghetto because my grandmother was working at the Aerodome in Alexota, and she was every day taken out. She hid my aunt under her coat, and Venkus met her on the way and took my aunt and hid her in a monastery somewhere right near Italio's Gatva. And he hid her in different places. At one point he had her hidden in a hospital, and the Germans came in to find all the Jews in the hospital and kill them. And he sat at her bedside and he recited Catholic prayers so the Germans should not know she's a Jew. But they said, we have to come in and check anyway. She was visibly Jewish. And he said, you can go in, but she has typhus. And the Germans were terrified of typhus, so they did not go in. That was how he saved his life. And a tremendous hero. We went to visit his grave yesterday. He's buried in Tuvanai, and this is just a little brief history of my family. 423 years in Lithuania. We came here in the 1600s. The immediate villages that my uncles and first cousins lived in Lithuania immediately prior to the Holocaust are the villages you see here. We have 55 family members who were murdered in the Holocaust, and 3 survived. 1 through Ambassador Tatakawa, and 2 through Pranas Venkus. And if I would say, I think Pranas Venkus really saved 3 because he also saved my grandmother and gave her 3 more years of life until she was murdered in the forest. So it's, for my family, this is a very moving research to realize that there are these great people, ordinary people, and I always love the contrast of the big ambassador, very powerful, and the simple village priest from Oputanai, a simple man, and each of them did their part to save my family and to, I think, bring honor to the Japanese nation and to the Lithuanian nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Questions? Until somebody will think about questions. I saw Dr. Portukaite name from Telsh in your documents. I think she operated me when I was one year old, some throat cut or something like that. I don't think she saved my life, but somehow here in this room, when the research, memoirs, heroes are in one, the fact means something to me. Anyway, I'm inviting you to ask questions, exploit this situation when we can. Yes, Linas Vanslauskas, please.
My question would be about your mother's story, since she was double refugee, first from Nazis in Klaipėda, then from Soviet Union in Kaunas. So what was the reason she was postponing or was not addressing Japanese consulate to ask Sugihara's visa? Why she decided, or the family decided, to stay longer?
We don't know. Well, I do have a letter from my grandfather in 1938 to Rabbi Dessler in London, saying that Hitler is coming and he's going to wipe us all out. We have the original letter, and what's going on in the Sudetenland is nothing compared to what will happen to us here in Clyde. That when Hitler comes, it will be the end of us. Please help save my daughters. So from that letter, we had a sense that from 1938, the family had an acute sense of the dangers of the Nazis. Yet my mother also shared that she had 5 uncles who were murdered by the Soviets. So I'm not so sure that they knew which devil would ultimately end up worse. And the history of the time was that the Soviets had already murdered many. And on my father's side, they'd arrested my grandfather. So their record was, in a sense, more clear, especially as related to religious Jews, than perhaps the Nazis were both. We don't know why she didn't try here.
Thank you.
More questions? If not, then thank you again.